Hello, I'm Jonathan Agnew. Welcome to the Test Match Special podcast, and Michael Vaughan is here with me. Usually we do this podcast after a match is finished, but unfortunately today we're speaking to you because an entire tour has been called off. England's one-day international series against South Africa has been abandoned without a ball being bowled due to positive COVID tests. Now, it's important to get all the information across here, so bear with me while I take you on a timeline. England landed in South Africa on the 17th of November. All their COVID tests were negative on arrival. The next day, one South African player tested positive and two close contacts were also put into isolation. On the 20th of November, 2 days later, another home player tested positive and their warm-up match was cancelled. Those two players returned negative tests a week later and the T20 series goes ahead, which England won 3-0. Then, on December the 3rd, another South African player tests positive. The next day's first one-day international is postponed. The second match should have been on Sunday. That was delayed after two members of the team hotel staff returned positive tests. England then had another round of testing, and for the first time, two members of their touring party returned positive tests. An extra match that was penciled in for today was postponed, and then this afternoon, the announcement that we all expected, the tour is off. However, there are still lots of questions about how the virus got into what was supposed to be a biosecure environment, how and when the England team can return home, and whether anyone will agree to play cricket in South Africa if there are question marks over biosecurity. Now, in a moment, we'll hear from the South African journalist Firdose Moonda, but Michael Vaughan, where do we start with this? It was never going to be straightforward, I don't think.
No, I mean, it's if you go back over the course of the last 6 months, it's remarkable that it's taken this long for this kind of scenario to come to the fore. There'll be some nervous England players because of the fact they've had to be tested again. Those two, we're not too sure which two in the camp had the positive test. They'll be hoping that the next test comes back negative and it allow them to travel home. Obviously, if those two are still positive, and there may be one or two others, if the pair have been around the squad, which they have been, there'll be some nervous England players and management thinking, wait a minute, if it comes back positive again, they're going to have to isolate in South Africa before they can travel anywhere. And there's some that's going over to Australia playing the Big Bash, so you can imagine if they have to do that, they'll have to do 10 days in South Africa, then another 14 days quarantining in Australia before they can play in the Big Bash. So worrying times for the England squad.
Just wonder if people got complacent after all those matches were staged uneventfully last summer here.
Well, I think we look back at the ECB in the summer, and it was a military operation that worked fantastically well. Again, we're not in South Africa, so it's kind of hard for us to comment. But the hearsay is that it's not been quite as military, it's not been quite as strict.
Well, they've been playing golf an hour away, apparently.
Yeah, and that's the England players as well.
Yeah.
South Africa and England. So I think England have got to hold their hands up and say, look, they've kind of relaxed the kind of system a little bit, but more so than it was in the UK. Very difficult to kind of point the finger at anybody to say, oh, it got in because of this or got in because of that. It's just happened. And as I said, it's now a nervous few hours for those England players and management to wait for those results to come back. I'm a bit surprised that they called the last game off, just in case, all the results came back negative tomorrow. They could have played on Wednesday and come back on Thursday. I think it's very important, even though it's tough. And it's not easy being in the bubble. If there was a chance of playing that last game on Wednesday because everything came back smoothly tomorrow, I would have kept that available and open. But they talk about the mental well-being of the players and obviously the physical well-being of the players. They've not been able to practice that much going into just a singular game. There's a little bit of me just feels that maybe they could have just played that game on Wednesday if everything was fine tomorrow. But that's the big if. If everyone's fine, they're going to be able to go home on Thursday, or players will be able to go over to Australia playing the Big Bash. If the two and maybe a few others are positive tomorrow morning, it's going to be tough times for a few of that England team.
Yeah, very true. Well, it throws up all sorts of problems for cricket South Africa, who've been going through their own boardroom crisis. And I've been speaking to the South African journalist Firdose Moonda from Cricinfo, who told me this is just the latest in a whole string of problems for cricket in the country.
if we go back to July when South Africa hosted the innovative new three-team competition in the middle of what was really the peak of the pandemic, and they had several players pull out for COVID-related reasons, including the national coach, Mark Boucher, who had COVID at the time. It just seems that something about the organization hasn't been really well thought through. And so hosting England in the Western Cape would have seemed like a good idea in August or September when we were starting to come out of lockdown. But we're now in a situation where cases are rising again in the Western Cape. We've narrowly escaped being declared a hotspot in this part of the country. It's also not a situation like you have in England where we've got hotels attached to the ground. There's still a little bit of a distance to travel. Players are playing golf out at Boshenmere, which is an hour's drive from Newlands. And I just think a lot could have been done differently and better. The three T20s happened, but even then there were positive cases in the South African camp. And I think there's just a lot of concern as to how well South Africa can host a bio bubble, given a real myriad of things, including that we're not a country that can afford to test professional sports people an unlimited number of times because we've got healthcare workers that need to be tested. We've got scant resources. There's a cost factor. Yeah, lots to think about.
Yeah. What do you do if you're the board, though? You're Cricket South Africa, which seems to be imploding anyway. You've got no money. You've got that sort of open window maybe of England coming and saving us millions of dollars and so on. Right. The temptation to play these games must have been huge from the board's perspective.
Definitely, but there's a huge financial incentive to play these games. So South Africa were hoping to host India for three T20s sometime in August, which was never going to happen because that was really when the virus peaked here. And those then were taken out of the budget, and that would have been a huge amount of money. And Cricket South Africa is facing massive losses in this 4-year cycle, 2019 to 2022. So really their only hopes of making some money were a successful tour of England, and then hopefully if Australia tour, although, even that is looking quite unlikely at this stage, given Australia and how they've handled the pandemic, and we'd probably be deep into second wave territory by then. So hosting England was going to make around $4 million, and the cancellation of the ODIs will result in around 2 million not being made. And so even though they've sort of said they've postponed and it may yet take place in the 4-year cycle, if you look at the fixture list and you look at what's coming up for both teams, it's very difficult to see how you will fit 3 ODIs in. So I think there's two things here. The one is financially, Cricket South Africa are in trouble, and they've also spent a lot of money trying to make this happen, testing lots of people, paying for all those tests, creating a bio bubble. And then the other is that it's possibly dented the confidence for teams who may want to come and tour here or are scheduled to come and tour here, where they're looking at this and saying, oh, we don't know if we feel comfortable going to South Africa anymore.
But is there a blame game going on for this? I noticed the article you wrote actually that you got the email from Western Province claiming that England they couldn't take responsibility for England's biosecurity because they went off and practiced on these nets that were out of bounds, so to speak. Is there lots of pointing of fingers going on?
I think there was a danger of that happening. So definitely earlier today we saw a little bit of tit for tat, and the Western Province email came out basically saying the players had gone to the nets. And the issue with that is that the nets are adjacent to a construction site, and there are construction workers at the venue pretty much throughout the day, and we've seen them there in domestic matches and so on. So England then hit back saying, first of all, that the practice facilities they were given were, in their words, unacceptable, and that they needed to go and use the nets, and that they had then created a security corridor so that they could walk from the outfield to the nets, and kind of putting the ball back in South Africa's court. Shortly after that happened, the series was then called off. So I think the tit for tat sort of ended there. I think the concern is that nobody has been able to determine how hotel staff tested positive and how a third South African player tested positive between the T20 and the ODI series, because, presumably no one would have been coming and going from the bubble in that period of time. Not all the hotel staff are staying at the hotel. So there's a significant portion who are, and the ones who come into contact with the players are, but some of them are not. And so I suppose, we could wonder forever if somebody touched something and somebody else touched something. And I guess the other thing is there's so much about this virus that we don't know. And I think the South African Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Shuaib Manjra, is a man of high integrity. And he's definitely been honest in saying, look, we understand the concerns. We recognize the concerns. We're trying to figure this out. But no, they don't know how it's happened yet. If you're England, it's pretty terrifying, isn't it? I mean, even if you're South Africa, you're in what you think is a secure environment, and the virus is spreading amongst people who work in different areas of the hotel and players who don't come into contact with each other at all.
And the implications, the possible implications, if these two tests do come back positive, is that England could be stuck there for 10 days in total. I guess they'll backtrack it to Saturday maybe when they went into quarantine. I mean, it could look really bad for South African cricket, to those who you say, including Australia, there's also Sri Lanka and Pakistan to travel to you. But if that's the way the England team end up, banged up in albeit a very nice hotel, but banged up nonetheless, that's not going to get people jumping on planes to come and play.
No, absolutely not. I mean, especially if you consider the timing. So, people are wanting to get home for festive season plans, but also they're players who've got big bash deals to honor, and they wanting to be able to travel to Australia. And I suppose it just continues to add days onto what is already a calendar where you're touring and away from home a lot of the time. So if people are having to add on 2 weeks at the start and a possible 10 days at the end if somebody ends up with COVID, and then perhaps 2 weeks quarantine when you get back to wherever you're going back to, suddenly a 6-week tour has become a 10 or 12-week tour, and it becomes impossible. So I think that is definitely going to be a concern. Something as simple as Sri Lanka are coming to South Africa, presumably over the festive period. They then return to Sri Lanka where they're due to play England, and England have just had this experience in South Africa. So if anybody would be concerned about Sri Lanka coming to South Africa, it may be England as much as it is Sri Lanka. Yes. And I think it's going to result in quite a conundrum of things happening, and maybe we just need less international cricket until a vaccine is rolled out, although, that means we lose an entire summer here in South Africa, because I don't think Africa will see the vaccine. They're talking about mid-2021. So it's really tricky for Cricket South Africa. Should neutral venues be used? Should they be hoping for sort of multi-team series, which are going to be played, somewhere like the UAE, because we saw the IPL go ahead without too many issues, apart from the bit at the start with the Chennai Super Kings players. And I just think it puts Cricket South Africa in such a difficult position. They don't have a lot of leadership at the moment. There's an acting CEO, there's an interim board, people are getting suspended every now and then, and this on top of it means that off the field, on the field, just nothing's working.
From a journalistic perspective, Firdose, I mean, do people feel there that, as people do hear a bit, that sport has sold out to TV, and the pressure to fulfil broadcasting deals is massive these days?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely being highlighted more and more, and that the only reason that there was such a push to have these matches take place in the end, beyond like World Cup Super League points or anything, was just the fact that Cricket South Africa need money. And it also kind of shows you the precarious nature of the broadcast deal, because South Africa only really make money when they're hosting one of England, India or Australia. And even then, they'll only make a decent amount of money if the result of those series is uncertain. And so there's, the broadcaster can hedge their bets on it being something exciting to watch. When they host Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., they're not making money. They're spending money because they're putting teams up, and now, they're putting them up in bubble environments. So it really means that the way for smaller nations who are not part of that big three to make money off cricket is multi-team tournaments, or having one of the big three come and tour. And, that means then that everybody wants the Indias, the Australias and the Englands, which puts pressure on them to play much more than maybe they would like to, and which puts pressure on the hosts to make sure that they can provide an environment that is safe. So I think, it's really showing us that I think cricket and the way it runs needs a bit of a rethink. International cricket and the way it makes money also needs a bit of a rethink.
Yeah. Did you think this would work? And I wonder how you feel today now that it hasn't.
I'm not sure what I thought, to be honest. I mean, I think, when we saw what happened with the 3TC in July, and initially they had announced a date and it was postponed, and it just seemed as though very little was going according to plan there. And then we saw kind of further meltdown of Cricket South Africa, which resulted in the entire board resigning and then them almost being suspended by the minister. There was a chance that this tour wouldn't have happened anyway, because South Africa's sports minister would have refused to officially recognize Cricket South Africa. So I can't even say what I thought in that it's just sort of things just bumble along. And every time we think, I'm sure nothing more could possibly go wrong, something completely unexpected happens. I did think that, knowing the facilities at the Vineyard and just knowing how committed people like Graham Smith's department were to making cricket happen, I didn't think it would have as many problems as it's ended up having. And I really think the big issue was the golf and the kind of going away from the venue to an estate an hour away. And sure, they were using a separate entrance and all of that. But that maybe should really be re-looked at. And then I think, trying to squeeze it in, because really this is in a very small time frame to get these matches in, and perhaps you need more of a window on either side. So I think now the real fear is that, South Africa are hoping to have a summer where they host Sri Lanka, where perhaps they go to Pakistan and then they host Australia and then Pakistan come here and that takes them to the start of an IPL. But it's looking as though something may not work according to plan. Perhaps everything won't work according to plan. And at the same time, if they don't get their house in order and the board to be more established, a permanent CEO to be appointed, money to be coming in, eventually we will have to feel the effects domestically. So South African cricket, interestingly, there have been no pay cuts so far and no retrenchments at national level. But I think that could change.
I just wonder what sort of charm offensive they're going to have to play with Australia in particular. Unknown administrators, this temporary feel to the board. It's not going to be easy, is it?
No, I mean, the other thing, of course, is that we don't actually know who will be the person talking to Australia, because ostensibly South African cricket should hold an AGM sometime in January, and then perhaps the process of appointing a permanent CEO will begin. And this interim board is only due to be in place until the end of January too. So I think it will probably end up that they're in place for 6 months instead of 3. And that the process of appointing a permanent CEO could be delayed. But at the moment, it's like nobody really even knows who's doing the talking and what sort of gravitas they have and what relationship they have, because ultimately that's kind of what makes these things work. Graham Smith was able to talk to Saurav Ganguly and secure those India matches, and then, of course, they didn't happen. But you kind of get the gist of what I'm trying to say there. So I think South African cricket just really, when people look at it from the outside now, they're seeing a situation that they can't even begin to dissect who's who and what's what and why so many people are involved and why the Olympic Committee wants to ban the board and why the minister's involved. And it's just looking chaotic, which, sure, it's been through chaotic times in the past, but I think the damage that's being done, the long-term reputational damage, is going to be so difficult for Cricket South Africa to come back from, their comparisons being made to, for example, Zimbabwe cricket, and without sort of getting into the implications in terms of it being a third world place and even a race implication that comes with it. I do think that they're treading very dangerous ground, Cricket South Africa. They've gone from being, one of the best organized, think of the IPL that was moved here in such a short period of time, the Football World Cup, to really just looking like a mess. And that's not good for anyone.
That's a really interesting perspective, isn't it? From Firdose Moonda from Cricinfo. And Michael Vaughan is still here. Lots to pick up on there, Michael. And I think the first thing is particularly the Australians. I mean, obviously it's the biggest payday for Cricket South Africa. We know that the Australians have more or less got things under control and done it the hard way in Australia as far as the virus is concerned. But the fact that they couldn't even stage a 3-match one-day international series is not going to look good, is it?
No, there's so many really good points that were made. I never like to hear the fact that money was an issue, because surely the World Game has to look after that. Surely if there is an issue in South Africa, they haven't got the money to be able to get the testings or put a proper bubble in place to make sure that these players are secure. Surely the ICC, or the powerhouse of 3, in terms of India, Australia and England, have to look after the game at this time. It can't be that South Africa don't have the money and yet they can't provide the bubble which is required because they haven't got the expenditure to go and get the right tests or get the right security. That can't be the case for cricket, because if it is, we're going to see many, many more of these kind of series that will end up like the one that we're seeing in South Africa. But
part of the problem, Michael, is that they've sold these, and ECBs are saying they've sold these broadcast rights so high that these 3 matches, as she was saying, it's going to cost them $2 million not to stage. I mean, it's
that's
we
why
know how colossal the English rights are. If you don't play them, if there's any reason why they're not played, that's a massive bill you've got to pay back.
Yeah, well, that's why I say that the expenditure has to come before the series starts in terms of making sure that the bubble is biosecure. And if it is that it's going to cost the game a little bit more money at this stage, the game, in terms of the ICC and the three powerhouses which have all the money, they've got to help out, because South Africa don't have the money. They don't have the finances of the ECB, of the BCCI, of the Cricket Board of Australia. They just don't have the same kind of money. There's no way Australia's going to go to South Africa. Absolutely no chance,
doesn't it? Yeah.
No chance, Aggers, that they'll go to South Africa. It's very difficult to get into Australia. They don't like their own to leave the country. So they're not going to go to South Africa, where there's just been a series cancelled because the bubble wasn't secure enough. But, somehow, for cricket to go on, the game has to look after the smaller countries that don't have the finances. Yeah. It can't be the case that now South Africa are going to be $2 million down. It might be more than that when you start looking at sponsorships and going forward. If the series against Australia is cancelled, again, a massive chunk of their revenue that they would have expected to come in. The broadcaster will want their money back, rightfully so. So there's going to be a big problem. I mean, we've got to be honest, South African cricket, it's a shambles. That's my honest opinion about the way that South Africa has been run recently. I just don't see it having any kind of structure of leadership from the CEO. There's just too many swapping and changing. There's too much mention of things that aren't quite right. So they have to get the house in order. But I do fear for countries like South Africa that haven't got the money to be able to put on these biosecure areas or arenas, whatever you may call them. And there will be other series. I'm amazed there's not been more. I have to say, I mean, New Zealand have got it right. That they seem to be putting on a very strategic military operation for their cricket to get put on. Australia are exactly the same. South Africa have failed, and that's something that they're going to have to try and get right, because there won't be many countries that will be sticking their hand up to go there.
Interesting, isn't it? A bit of a smoke screen, perhaps, this business of the nets at Newlands. You can see the administrators there just trying to offload some of the blame for what's happened and how particularly the visitors got it. This whole question of, well, they used those nets they weren't supposed to, but it's a bit of a shame that's popped up, really.
Yeah, that's nonsense. Let's be honest. I mean, I'm sure, when England were practicing, they'd have made sure that there was no anyone from the construction area anywhere near the players. I'm sure they weren't going around touching poles and touching walls. They'd have just gone straight to the net, hit a few balls, and then come back. I find that a bizarre kind of finger point. We don't want that. We don't want finger points to anyone. This is an unfortunate situation. But when you hear that they haven't got the testing and they don't have the money to put the biosecure environment around the teams, as much as we had in the UK, we've got hotels at the actual grounds here. We're very fortunate. It's a real fine balance, though, Aggers, because you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So in the summer here, when it was a military operation, right for the so by the third or 4 months, the players were like, come on, we need to be released. This is ridiculous. It's hurting the mental side of all the individuals involved. We felt it, Aggers, in and around that bubble. It wasn't easy. So I think these bubbles now are trying to get a little bit more relaxed, which allows the players to go and play golf. It might be an hour away from the hotel, but it had been, I would think, in terms of the England team, a very strict strategic plan of how they got there, played, and got back in the car and came straight back to the hotel. Because players do need that. You can't just lock players up. They've been in these bubbles for 6 months. They've gone from a bubble in the UK to the UAE with the IPL, straight to South Africa. Some are going to Australia.
They're taking the toll now too, aren't they? I mean, there's certainly 2 England players who aren't going to go to the Big Bash. There might be more. And it's interesting. The ECB said at the end of the summer they wouldn't do those bubbles in the same way again. I mean, you can see they clearly are taking their toll on the players now.
Yeah, and that's why we can't be too critical, because they've probably tried to relax it a little bit in South Africa, because I'm sure players would have demanded a little bit more relaxation around the bubble, because it was so strict and strategic that worked here. But over time, I think those bubbles will get a little bit more relaxed. They relaxed them in the IPL in the UAE and Dubai, where they were allowed to go and play golf, have a bit of a relaxing time. They were in certain segments at the beach that were allowed to go and potter around the beach on the days off, and players enjoyed that. And I think it's right that if you just look at, I've just seen David Milan over the last couple of days He's arrived in in Australia from South Africa. He's been put in this little box room. He was promised a balcony, he's not got one. Promised a running machine in his room, not got one. And he says that the food is absolutely dreadful. Now, I don't want anyone to feel sorry for a cricketer, because there's a lot more people in the world worse off. But to be thrown into a room, and I think it's just wrong on people. Forget cricketers. For people to go and sit for 2 weeks staring at a wall. I think that's a real.
Well, maybe
ask.
the hope of this vaccine might make one or two cricketers actually focus their minds and say, I'm not going to go this time. Hopefully, in a few months' time, we can actually get back to some sort of normality, and I don't need to go and sit in a box for 2 weeks. I can just say no thanks.
Well, yeah, and Tom Banton didn't surprise me when he pulled out. Tom Curran's done exactly the same. Just not willing to leave what's been a bubble in South Africa to then go to Australia, have that 2-week quarantine period. They're not willing to do that. I was meant to be in Australia this winter, Aggers, and for that reason, I didn't want to go and put myself through that. I didn't like being in the bubble in the summer, so I stuck my hand up early and said, look, I'm more than happy to miss it. And I think there may be one or two more players, particularly that have been around the England team of the last few days. It's not easy, as I said at the start of the podcast. If you're one of those players waiting for your results, and there's been 2 already that came back positive, and they're hoping that it was a false positive, what happens is there's a few more tomorrow morning, they can't come back.
Yeah.
I know there's many people like, but they're in the Vineyard Hotel in South Africa, but they can't do anything. They have to sit in the rooms.
Yeah, I must say also, I was a bit surprised they kept the same team for those 3 games. But you've got people sitting in there, sitting in bubbles and everything else. I mean, you give up a game, don't you?
Yeah, well, and I think that's probably, if this carries on for any much longer, I think teams are just going to have to almost have 2 teams. Yeah. And there's a team that plays the T20s, there's a team that plays the 50 overs, and potentially 3 teams, a team that plays the test matches. It's very difficult to keep them all locked up like they have done. One
thing that Firdose and I did agree on in that chat as well was about how cricket is so dependent, and all sports are, to be fair, or at least all major sports on broadcasting money, and that's why these games are being played. It's why the games are played in the summer, of course, to try and save the board money. They still lost £100 million, but the size of these contracts, and therefore the penalties when something goes wrong. And look at England's schedule; they've got 2 tests in Sri Lanka probably coming up, 4 against India, T20s in India, the IPL for those who want to go and play in that, home series against New Zealand, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, 5 tests against India, then T20s in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and that's before they even got to the T20 World Cup, and that's before the Ashes. I mean, what sort of schedule is that?
Well, it's a very busy one. It's very, very busy. They can't play.
It's just dawning on me now, actually.
Yeah, that's why I keep saying just enjoy your time off for the minute, because once we get on the train next year, it's not stopping, which, I'm certainly not going to complain about that. I'm desperate to go and commentate on cricket and be at venues, see some crowds back, hopefully. But, the ECB are going to have to manage those players accordingly. They're going to have to give them, times away from the game. It might be that we see plenty of new players within the teams, which is fine. I think England will have to pinpoint what's important next year, which is obviously the T20 World Cup and the Ashes. And they'll have to really work around the test to make sure that they get a test team that's got a chance of competing in Australia. And they have been, with the T20 team, you felt that by the fact that England played the same team 3 times, Owen Morgan had almost settled on an 11 and was happy with it, and thought, I'll just keep playing that, and I'm sure that'll carry on through to the T20 World Cup. But the 50 overs, you would think, could be the format, Aggers, that we'll see quite a few younger players or new players brought in. Yeah, I think so. I think that'd be sensible, and I don't think we as broadcasters or the fans out there could complain if they arrived to a ground and they kind of went, who's playing? I wouldn't be expecting the likes of Butler, Archer, Stokes to be playing too much 50 over cricket next year.